Cops have to arrest all different types of people. However, what happens when it's a cop's own boss that he has to put in handcuffs? Here are 4 examples of this incredibly rare situation, starting with the case of Michael Yarrow on June 20, 2023. A Georgia police officer pulled over a Dodge Charger that was going way over the 35 mph in speed limit. However, when he walked up to the window, he got a huge surprise. The man behind the wheel was Chief Deputy of the local PD, Michael Yarrow, not the person this officer expected to pull over, but in reality, this changes nothing, and the officer asks Yarrow to give over his license and registration, something he's not pleased with at all. If body cams weren't around, this stop could have gone a totally different way, but it seems like this officer isn't the biggest fan of Yarrow and decides to issue him a citation for speeding, for some handing. Your boss a $500 fine. Is a dream come true, and it looks like it's the same way for this officer. In Georgia, speeding tickets are priced based on how much you're exceeding the speed limit. For example, if you're over 24 miles an hour over, you're looking at $500 in fines. However, there's an extra super speeder charge you're liable to if you're going as fast as Yarrow was, but it looks like this officer decided to mess with his boss even more, as this ticket excluded the extra fee, but instead required him to appear in court after the incident. Yarrow was also suspended for 40 hours without pay. However, that's Scott Birdsey, just a fraction of what Corporal Scott Birdsey was hit with after crashing his car while drunk. Obviously, Brooke and Scott are familiar with each other, and curiously, Scott holds nothing back when describing exactly how the incident went down. It's clear that Scott is the one at fault here. So, before going any further, Brooke decides to call back to the base to ask whether or not it's okay for her to be handling this incident. It's obvious that Scott is under the influence of something, judging by his slurred speech, slowed reactions, and slight loss of motor control. Brooke is fairly sure he's been drinking at this point. Scott is no longer her supervisor, he's just a suspect in a case, and what's more, he's drunk and likely unpredictable, a combination which can be incredibly threatening to a female officer. After a short wait, another officer arrives at the scene, meaning they can finally start getting to the bottom of all of this with some sobriety tests. These lasted over 10 minutes, but it's not hard to tell how they went by just looking at a few seconds of them, judging by this and the overwhelming amounts of evidence against him. At this point, the officers thought it was safe to conclude that Scott had been drinking that night and decided it was time to put him in cuffs, something he was far from happy about. Despite Scott being of the most polite and respectful suspects ever on this channel, he was actually hit with a better sentence than the majority of criminal cops after blowing up 156 back at the station. He was charged with driving under the influence and damaging property. He was ordered to pay just under $1,000 in fines, serve 50 hours of community service, and take multiple substance abuse in DUI classes, and had his driver's license suspended for 6 months. He was also sued by the driver of the vehicle he hit, and a cash settlement was reached. And on top of all of that, he also was suspended without pay for a week and given a last chance agreement, meaning one more slip-up, and he was out for good. But when New Mexico police were put in the same position, they instead showed just how corrupt America's cops can be. This cop pulled over a truck in Lordsburg after suspecting the driver may have been drinking. However, after walking up to the window, he was hit with a wave of shock and disappointment. The driver was the city's mayor, and this was the 3rd time she's been pulled over for this exact offense. And what's worse, she was driving like this with her foster child in the car. The cops are now in an extremely awkward position, but after a short chat, they decide that they should proceed with the stop normally and do their jobs, at least for now. As Glenda exited the vehicle, both of the officers noticed a strong smell of alcohol on her, and she quickly admitted to having a few drinks that night. Her slow speech and movement implied that she's definitely over the legal limit to drive. But this is the 3rd time she's been pulled over for driving drunk. Will this really be the time she's punished for it? This officer certainly thinks there's a chance. As the officer said, Glenda is their boss, so there's clearly a conflict of interest here. So they call up New Mexico State Police to handle it from here, but when the original cops learn of the outcome, They realized they probably could have done a better job themselves. Somehow, despite all the clues that the first two officers picked up, the state cops decided she wasn't over the limit when they arrived and was therefore free to drive. Now there's obviously the debate of corruption here, given that she's the mayor. But let's take his word is fact for now. The cop decided he thinks Glenda is at a 06 right now. But this was an hour after the initial stop was made, taking into account that your blood alcohol level drops at a rate of around 0.15 an hour. Glenda was getting extremely close to the coveted 0.8 she'd be charged for. You may also be wondering why the cops didn't just use a breathalyzer to test her blood alcohol level immediately. The answer there lies in the Fourth Amendment. Cops have to provide probable cause that a driver is impaired before they're allowed to collect chemical evidence. That proves this. That's what the sobriety tests are. For the combination of these two problems is what led to Glenda going home that night instead of to jail. Why this is her third time being pulled over for this, and why it probably won't be her last. But unfortunately for this next boss, his employee wasn't so kind when it came to his DUI stop. Okay, this guy isn't just drunk, he's absolutely hammered, even to the point where he thinks the camera can't hear him whispering. But despite the captain's pleas, the officer refuses to turn off his camera and continues with the investigation. Those must have been a strong few beers, as not only was he stumbling over his words, but apparently also swerving across both lanes. On his way home, the captain is then searched and told to stand in the open, where he's tested on his balance and sobriety, even as the captain begs him to turn his camera off and just talk. The officer stands his ground and states that he has to treat everyone the same, or his job and livelihood could be at risk. He's showing a fantastic amount of integrity that unfortunately we don't get to see too often. Likely due to people like this trying to pull rank, they then continue with the third and final test, involving simply walking, heel to toe, for 10 steps. Now that the investigation is concluded and the purpose placed under arrest, the officer turns off his camera and returns the captain to the police department. Not only was he suspended from his position as Oklahoma police captain, but he was also hit with the regular punishments for DUI, likely amounting to a small fine and a few months in jail. If you enjoy true crime videos like this, make sure you're subscribed to see more.